Okay, so welcome to our Growing Great Strawberries presentation for December. We're going to talk a little bit about the family. We're going to talk about plant selection, planting and site selection, watering, mulching, fertilizing, pest management, resources, and questions. And anytime I learn something about a new vegetable that I haven't grown before, so I've got my cast of characters that I'm used to growing in the garden. But every time I try something new, I try to kind of think about these bullet points in my mind and learn about these different topics. So I try to think about plant selection. What's the appropriate plant for me? Where to plant them and what sites to pick? What kind of water requirements do they have? And for a lot of edibles, vegetables and fruits, the water requirements are pretty similar. Think about whether mulching is an appropriate choice. I think about whether fertilizing needs to happen, and if it does, at what stage. What kind of pests like to attack this edible? And then from those things, I gather my resources. So any kind of fruit or vegetable, any kind of edible that you're trying to grow, try to break it down into these categories, and that will help you advance your gardening skills and also give you specific questions to research. So at first, when I wanted to grow something like artichokes that I didn't know a lot about, then I just did internet searches. I always include the letters UC, A, and R for the University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources in my search words so that I can find things that are relevant, but I'll put in like watering artichokes or mulching artichokes. And there's also other states that have good information. When you do search information, like I know for blueberries, a lot of the information that comes up is from Oregon and also some of it's Washington. And so we just want to make those adjustments for recommendations like planting times. And our UC Master Gardener Helpline in San Bernardino County is always here to help you. And I have information on that. It can be found on our website, and it's also at the end of this presentation. But you can always call to ask questions about your edibles or your other plants in your yard. So the strawberries are in the rose family, and it includes more than 3,400 species. That includes trees, shrubs, and herbs. They're forbs or herbs that lack a woody stem. Strawberries are. And so they're an herbaceous broadleaf plant, but not like grass. They're not grass-like. True berries are produced from the fruit of a single ovary. So what we often think of as berries are aggregate fruits and are often called common berries. The seeds that you see on the outside of the strawberries are called achenes. And so here's the fruit of the strawberry with the seeds. And so actually, I had always understood that this was the fruit of the strawberry, but from my research, this is actually the fruit. It's not very much fruit, but this is the fruit itself, and it contains the seed. Here is sort of an anatomy of your strawberries. Here we have the roots, we have the leaf structure. Getting to know the crown of your strawberries is really important, and being able to identify that will really help you be successful with planting and growing strawberries. And most strawberry production is going to be done through runners or daughter plants that come off the strawberries. And we'll come back to this drawing in a little bit. Here's another drawing of strawberries. It's in French, but I thought it was a nice drawing. Here is the achenes, still the same in French. And so, you know, you may have seen, I've never seen this in person, but you may have seen this, and this is possible because each one of those strawberry seeds is a plant in itself, but that's usually not the way we're producing strawberries. So when you're thinking about selecting your plants, then you want to look for qualities, especially in strawberries, like the time of year that they ripen, whether they're June bearing, ever bearing, or day neutral. And you want to think about what kind of harvest you would like. Do you want a lot of strawberries throughout the year? Do you want strawberries like a big crop at one time, which maybe you want to do that if you're preserving? You might also want a big crop at one time if you have a lot of pest pressure. If you have a lot of squirrels or something that steal your fruit, then maybe having a lot of fruit at one time might be better. Maybe if you just like to go outside and nibble on strawberries here or there, then you want something that is going to be producing a little bit throughout the year. There's a lot of variety in strawberry flavors, and I have some great websites. Like I said earlier, I like to use the University of California or other university or extension resources so that I know that I'm getting peer-reviewed research. I do want to share with you a couple of really great websites that are not university websites, but most of the information I saw on there looked pretty spot on. So it's a recommendation. It's a website that, oh, hold on just 1 second, please. Pardon me for 20. Sorry about that. My daughter was locked out of the house. Flavor. Let's talk about flavor. There's lots of different, oh yeah, and so some of the websites that I'm sharing, really great websites. We're not endorsing the things that they advertise, but some really good information on different flavor profiles. The time to maturity is, I think, also sort of tied into the time they ripen. You want to maybe pick strawberries that have certain disease resistance qualities if you've had issues in your garden. And then maybe something that's heat tolerant, or if you have a shady area, there may be a variety that you can find that tolerates a little bit of shade, or something that tolerates the cold. If some of the strawberries, I've seen some really beautiful strawberry plants that produce pink flowers, and they also, when they get cold or have certain exposure to different types of nutrient deficiencies, or it gets some really pretty purple foliage. And so some people use strawberries for landscaping, and they can be really pretty. So it's not your typical sort of edible strawberry. I don't think the strawberries are not inedible, but they are not as good tasting as the ones that we grow for flavor. And then if you're seed saving from strawberries or interested in saving old world varieties, then you might want to look for heirloom varieties. I do want to note, I do mention seed saving at the end of the presentation, but seed saving with strawberries and growing strawberries from seed is definitely not the most productive way to grow strawberries. You can grow them from seed, but it adds several years to the time when you'll get strawberries themselves. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But if you are planning to try to seed save from them, or you're wanting to save like an old variety that may not be that common anymore, then you might want to look for an heirloom or open pollinated variety. And you might be looking for a hybrid variety if you're looking for something that has disease resistance. A lot of times that disease resistance is in some kind of hybridization that they do. So the different types, we have June bearing, ever bearing, day neutral, and then wild strawberries aren't really in a different category, but like this picture of the white strawberries, those are alpine strawberries. Those are a wild or European strawberry. So the June bearing produces a large concentrated crop in mid-June to early July. The June bearing is going to produce the large berries over a short amount of time. And so if that's what you're looking for, then you want to get a June bearing variety. An ever bearing variety produces two crops, usually one in the summer and a second one in the fall. So you may be interested in that. And then there's a day neutral variety, which will produce produce fruit throughout most of the growing season, which is going to be late spring, early summer into the fall. And then you have your wild strawberries, which are a day neutral strawberry. So that's going to be one that produces a little bit throughout the year. And sometimes, I know when it comes to certain plants, then if you go to the nursery and you're not ordering online, I haven't done any strawberry purchasing online. I'm sure there's a market where you can buy probably plants that are shipped, in a short amount of time, and you might have more selection. But usually when you go to the garden center, I've noticed that I have a choice between like one or two different types of strawberries. So you may live near a larger garden center, but you may not have a choice. So for me, when I've bought strawberries in the past, I've just gone and purchased what they had, but knowing what, so I didn't have control over the dune bearing, ever bearing, or day neutral. But at least knowing what those three different things are helped me know what to expect and to know whether my plant was doing what it was supposed to be doing and when to expect the crop. There's a really great, we'll have this in the resources that I'll share at the end. And this talks about some other things to consider other than harvest season. And it's the flavor that I talked about already. Also, they talk about processing quality on this website. This is, I can't remember, see, Minnesota. Oh, it says, this is somewhere in the upper East Coast. I apologize, I can't remember which university this is, but they talk about like how well they freeze and thaw and some different factors. So this is something that you can check out if you're interested. I'll share this resource at the end, but these are all things to consider. So when you're thinking about your site selection and planting your strawberries, make sure that they're in full sun with a minimum of 6 to 8 hours per day. And the ideal time to plant strawberries in Southern California is in the fall. Probably the second best time is probably like now, assuming we don't get some really cold weather. And then planting strawberries in the spring is okay too, but they won't have had a chance to get a really good root development. So I usually find strawberries most commonly sold in the nursery in the spring, but that's not always the best time to buy them. But I bring that up because if you are planting them now, or maybe next year in the fall, keep in mind that the strawberries are going to want 6 to 8 hours of daylight in the summertime, and the sun will shift in your garden during the winter and summer. So a lot of times if people set up a vegetable garden in the one season, they're maybe surprised that the sun is not where they thought it was. So vegetable gardens that are set up in the summertime, sometimes they don't have enough sun exposure as the sun goes south, and maybe the vegetable garden is shaded by a tree. Or sometimes, depending on where your trees are, although usually in the summertime, the sun goes more overhead, so we get more sun. But sometimes if you set up a vegetable garden in the wintertime, in the summertime, the sun might not be ideal. So just think about the fact that if you are doing any planting right now, that the sun is farther to the south and it's going to be coming more overhead. So usually in the wintertime, if you're setting something up, you're going to get more sun, but strawberries need a minimum of 6 to 8 hours per day. They do prefer slightly acidic soil, and they are susceptible to salt burn. And so we'll talk about fertilizing them in a little bit, which is sort of the tie-in to salt burn and also the acidic soil, but they'll usually do pretty well in regular potting soil. They like a soil that's rich in organic matter, and they really prefer a well-draining soil. They're going to struggle in heavy clay. So if you have heavy clay-like soil and you're hoping to plant in the ground, then you're probably going to want to amend your soil with compost to improve the drainage or grow them in pots. This strawberry pot that I think most people have seen, the purpose of this is to have lots of plants that can have the fruit sort of growing and draping without sitting on the ground. So, and also the roots can develop nicely inside. There's a lot of soil in this pot. The roots can develop nicely. Strawberries can grow without sitting on the ground. They can get lots of sun exposure. And so this may be a good choice if you have heavy clay-like soil. The pollinators are needed for crop production, but berries can be fully covered. So once you do get berries, if you have a bug issue, you can cover them. Or when they're not blooming, if you're having some sort of pest issue, you can cover them. But while they're flowering, you definitely want to make sure they have full exposure to pollinators, because poor pollination can result in like misshapen fruit. When you're preparing your site, we already talked about the soil type, that they prefer a soil that is rich in organic matter and is well draining. If it's heavy clay soil and you've amended it, you might also want to consider planting on like these berms For example, like on the lower right-hand side, that might help keep them from sitting in the water. And you can add a slow release fertilizer when you're planting the transplants. If you add something that has a little bit more phosphorus in it, that can help promote root growth. So like when you're planting in the fall or right now, the only danger with planting right now is if we get some really cold weather, you might need to protect them from the frost, but we'll talk about that in just a moment. But you can add a slow release fertilizer when you're preparing the soil. You can add compost to the soil and mix it in thoroughly. Compost is great for so many things in the soil. It helps increase the beneficial organisms. It helps increase drainage. If your soil is very sandy, it helps increase water retention, but it's not a replacement for fertilizer. It's usually pretty low in nutrients. Still great stuff, but not a replacement for fertilizer. And then you just want to make sure, however you have your strawberries set up, that the water will drain away from the strawberries and that the plants are not going to sit submerged if and when we do get rain. You want the plants to be about 10 inches apart. And if you have 2 rows, you want those 2 rows to be about 18 inches apart. Okay. You can plant mothers, which is, we'll go back to the drawing. There we go in just a second, but you can plant mothers or daughters or seeds, and we'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. The seeds could be started indoors or in greenhouses, and one of the websites I'm sharing has a whole section on starting the seeds. If you're interested in that adventure, you want to follow the directions for spacing, so about 10 to 18 inches apart, and make sure you plant them at the right depth, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Strawberries do like space and may need about 18 inches to allow the daughters and runners to develop. So again, where's my cursor? There it is. So you want them to be about 10 inches apart, and then here you can see they're about 18 inches apart, and that will allow room for the daughters to develop. The daughter plants, if you'd like to harvest from your plants, and we'll talk, I'm pretty sure we talk more about that in just a little bit. But so the daughter plants can be harvested in the late fall and then transplanted. Another option is, this is from one of the university websites, just in case you wanted to share some or hold some over, you could dig up the daughter plants in October, shake the soil from their roots, remove all but 2 healthy leaves, and place them in thin sandwich bags. And you could hold them in the refrigerator for 10 to 15 days and then plant them into clean, prepared beds. So maybe you're planting in a different section, or for whatever reason you would want to hold on to them for a little bit, that would be the process to do that. Or if you wanted to share them with somebody, for example. But otherwise, you can harvest the daughters and just plant them directly. Now, the plants need to be replaced every 2 to 3 years. Even a healthy strawberry, its life cycle, it is a perennial, but it's probably only going to last a couple seasons. So usually in that first season, it's growing, and the second season, it's really going to produce fruit. And the third season, you want to let it make the daughter plants, and that's probably when it's going to start to die back. So if you see people that have like a large strawberry patch, where it's just sort of like a section of their yard with a lot of strawberries, and they're not doing any maintenance, those plants aren't staying alive for probably more than 3 or 4 years. What's probably happening is that the way the plants are, the daughters are just replacing them, and the other ones are kind of dying back. You want to make sure the roots are fully spread out when you're planting your strawberries, and don't plant them too deep. And we'll talk about that again in just a second. The mulching the beds with straw can help keep pests off. Slugs and snails really like strawberries, and mulch can help keep the pests off, and it can help keep the plants warm, especially if you're going to plant now when we get a cold winter. And it also helps keep the soil from drying out. So when you're planting your strawberries, and it took me a while in planting strawberries to get to really be familiar with these 3 lines here. But once you start to pay attention, then you really can see it pretty easily. It's kind of cool. So you've got the, you got the leaves, the live part of the strawberry, you've got your flowers, and then there's a little bit of dead part up here. And this is the crown area. So this is where the living plant starts, and it's starting to connect to the root area. Planting at this depth, where there's still some of that green growth, is too deep, and you're going to cause the strawberry plant probably to die back. It'll be susceptible to pathogens. If you see down here, you can see the fibrous roots. And if any of these fibrous roots are exposed, then it's too shallow. It's probably maybe a little bit better to plant too shallow than too deep, but the roots that are exposed will die back. So you want to plant just in the middle right here, between the crown and the roots. That is the right depth. Okay, and then it's going to send these runners out. They're really easy to identify. The way they come out, it's a more woody stem with a small little plant, and then it has little roots on it. So very easy to identify the runners from the flowering plants. And so the first year, I think I have a slide about this, but I don't want to forget, and it's good to talk about it while the photo's out. So the first year that you have your strawberry plants, and maybe even the second year, you want to cut back these runners back here at the base of the plant, because they're taking energy away from the plant making fruit. So you want to cut these back for the first year and maybe the second year. And then the third year, let the runners develop. There may be a reason on the second year why you want the runners to develop, or I guess even in the first year, if you were looking to get lots of plants, then you might want to let these runners go. But when you're letting the runners develop, it is taking away energy from the fruiting part of the plant. So the fall is the best time to plant to allow them to establish roots before the spring and summer production. So the best time I would say is October, when it started to cool down, November. But sometimes we are kind of limited on when we can purchase strawberries. And so if you're purchasing a strawberry anytime from, I would say, like late May or June through September, it doesn't mean you can't plant that strawberry, but during the time of year, the strawberry plant would most likely be focusing on fruiting, and it will need some extra attention to get it established. If you're planting your strawberries between, I'm guessing between now and February, depending on the kind of year we have, it is possible they'll need a little protection if their root systems are not really established. Strawberries can kind of go dormant or die back a little bit, and then they'll pop back in the spring. But sometimes if they're newly planted and we get a real cold snap, it might be too cold for them. So the ideal time to plant is October, November, and then the second best time, like I said, is now, probably, as long as it doesn't get too cold. And then planting anytime after April, you might not get very much of a crop that first year, and you're probably going to have to really keep an eye on them during the summer to make sure they don't dry out. But a lot of times when you can find the strawberries is, I noticed last year I was really paying attention, and they sell them like spring and late spring, and that's not the ideal time to plant them. So just keep that in mind. If you guys have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourselves as we go along. Don't be shy. Strawberries like evenly moist soil, kind of like a wrung out sponge. Better to check them before you water them. They don't want to be sitting any way where they're getting soggy. Here they look like they're growing in some sort of tube or pipe, or maybe this is something with plastic covering it. You can see the strawberry foliage then is not sitting on the ground, and the strawberry fruit wouldn't be sitting on the ground. It almost looks like somebody's rooftop and some sort of gutter. If you can avoid getting water on the foliage, obviously they'll get wet if it rains, but the more water on the foliage, the more likely it is you're to get some fungal or mildew type pathogens. So you want to avoid that if you can. Drip irrigation is a good way to water, but you do want to look out, and I'm pretty sure I have a slide that shows salt burn. And sometimes if it's a really dry year or you over fertilize and you're using drip irrigation, and you may get salt burn, but usually drip irrigation is a good way to water strawberries. If you're using furrows or troughs, just make sure you're watching out that the leaves and the fruit are not sitting in the trough or furrow. And then some sites recommend cutting back watering when the fruit starts to form. And that's true for a lot of different fruits. I've seen that recommendation for fruit trees and for tomatoes. And the idea is that if you cut back on the watering, then it kind of enhances the flavor. But you have to be pretty good and consistent and paying attention to your plants, because sometimes if you cut back too much, it can cause the fruit to drop or not form properly. So that's something that I haven't played around with too much, because I'm just not that attentive of a gardener. But if you are very attentive to your garden, then you might want to consider cutting back a little bit on the water when the fruit starts to form, help enhance the flavors, that should say. I guess I didn't finish that sentence there. And then just remember that if they are in a pot, the container material will affect how often you need the water. So if you have strawberries in one of those strawberry pots, and you have other strawberries in like a black plastic pot or a wooden pot or something, they'll probably all dry out at different rates, even if you have the same type of strawberries and they're sitting in the same corner of your yard or whatever. So we always recommend to check the soil before watering. Your finger in the soil about an inch, and you want to see that it's actually starting to dry out. And so you want a little bit on the dry side, but not letting it get completely dry, but definitely not soggy. So here's an idea. This is, what do they call that? Totally blanking on what they call that. Oh, a wicking system. I think this is what this picture is. These are buckets, and you can see the soil is sitting in there, and you can see a water line running here. I'm not exactly sure what's going on, but one of the things that could be going on this photo on the right is this is an irrigation system that adds water to the bottom of the bucket, and then the bucket inside has some sort of wick that draws water up into the bucket. And so this would be, if that is what's going on, a wicking system, and you can look them up online. And I've heard some people have really great success with them, and some people not like that system. I think it just kind of depends on what works best for you. But a wicking system would be a great way to keep the plants evenly moist, but not let the foliage get wet. And then if you're growing some, like this is an Oya, for example, and this looks like an Oya in the center of a pot, and you have the strawberries growing here. If you were to put water in the Oya is like a clay pot that you bury underground. Usually it's buried a little bit deeper than that, and then you have a cap on top, and you put water in, and the water sort of diffuses through the clay. And this is another way that might help keep the leaves from getting wet, but keep the soil evenly moist. And the only thing with an Oya is usually the Oya only waters, I would say, about a hand's width or length, so about 5 inches away from the Oya. So again, I think this is a small Oya in like a plastic pot, and then the strawberries are growing around it. But probably when you're establishing the strawberries, before they've found the water that's coming from around the Oya, then they might need a little supplemental water. Mulch is a great way to keep weeds out and moisture in. And for strawberries, mulch can be great because it also helps keep snails and slugs away from your plants and keeps the warmth in. So a lot of times people will mulch with straw around strawberries in the wintertime to help keep them warm and to help keep pests away. I noticed that at my house, the squirrels love any straw that I put out. So you have to balance the pests that you have in your garden. Whether do you have more snails and slugs? Do you have more squirrels? Here somebody has used some sort of, I think they probably did for the photo, but they're doing something to keep those strawberries from sitting on the ground. If you are using mulch, you want to keep your fire danger in mind. Even though we had a little bit of rain and a little bit of relief from our fire danger, fire season is pretty much year round. now in Southern California. And so you just want to make sure that if you're putting a lot of mulch out, that you're keeping your fire danger in mind and sort of weighing those two things. We encourage using some sort of non-dyed and non-synthetic mulch when possible. And if you are using mulch, then just remember that if you when you're fertilizing, you either want to use a liquid fertilizer, or if you're using a granular fertilizer, you might want to pull the mulch away a little bit. When you're fertilizing, at planting, we mentioned you can use a slow release fertilizer. So it can be like an all-purpose fertilizer or a phosphorus rich fertilizer that's for root establishment. So if you have your NPK, I don't think I have a, so like a fertilizer bag will have nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, NPK as the numbers, then the phosphorus is the second number. And you can also see a lot of times it will be labeled like high phosphorus fertilizer, and that helps with root development. So when you're planting in the fall, or probably even now, then you might want to plant with a little bit of high phosphorus fertilizer to help with root development. In the growing season, you can fertilize them about every 4 to 6 weeks. So if you're planting now or you're planting in October, then you can fertilize when planting, and then they kind of go dormant. They don't completely die back, but you probably won't need to fertilize again until February, when the plants are ready to start setting. When you see them starting to send out flowers, then you can start fertilizing them about every 4 to 6 weeks from there. You don't have to fertilize that often, so you could fertilize at planting, fertilize again in February, and then if they're going to stay in the ground for another year, some people rotate their strawberries out, or they just try it one season and they don't keep them going. But if they are going to, if you do want them to grow year after year, then you could fertilize in the summer. I wouldn't fertilize any more than 4 to 6 weeks. And the other recommendation is about 3 to 4 times per season. If you are growing in pots, always we recommend that you fertilize half as much as you would put in the ground, and then you fertilize twice as often. And that just helps keep from burning your plants. Compost, as I said, is not a replacement for fertilizer, but it is great. And then you just want to read labels, and there's organic fertilizers, conventional fertilizers, slow release fertilizer, which is like a granular fertilizer, like an Osmocote or something. And then there's the water soluble fertilizers like a Miracle Grow. If you have questions about fertilizer, you can always reach out to our Master Gardener helpline. But usually they have pretty good information on the back of the packages, and you can just read the labels. But in general, fertilize when planting with a little bit high phosphorus fertilizer or an all-purpose fertilizer. Fertilize again in February when they start to wake up for the season. And then you can fertilize about every month and a half, or just once again in the summer, depending on your fertilizer. A slow release fertilizer doesn't need to be applied as often as the water soluble or quick release fertilizers. So this was from a strawberry nitrogen deficiency. This was a website that had information about nutrient deficiencies in strawberries. So these are some different nutrient deficiencies that are tied to strawberry issues. Let's see, these are some strawberry issues. There we go. Leaf issues that are tied to nutrient deficiency. There we go. Some different nitrogen deficiencies. But if you have questions about your strawberries, you can always take a photo of them and then send them to us. Some of the strawberries will also turn this color in response to the cold. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's a nutrient deficiency. So if you have questions about what's going on with your strawberries, you can call our helpline or send us a picture. I'm pretty sure I have one about saltburn, but just in case I don't. Saltburn the leaf won't be wilted, but it will be brown around the edges. I'm pretty sure I do have a picture of that. You can rotate your strawberry plants. Our UC integrated pest management site has, if you're having problems with your plants, then you'll want to avoid putting strawberries where you've had things in the Solanaceae family, like tomatoes, potatoes, eggplants, and cucurbits, peppers that are susceptible to verticillium wilt. They may be issues there. So if you've been having disease issues with your tomatoes, potatoes, eggplants, or cucumbers, then I wouldn't recommend planting strawberries there. But this is a great question for a helpline. You can reach out to us, and then the UC Integrated Pest Management site has some information that I'll put in the chat about rotating your plantings. For pruning, you can prune your day neutral strawberries. Those are the ones that kind of produce a little bit, remember, throughout the year. In the late fall, after the first year of growth, and you want to keep the diseased branches and leaves trimmed off the plant. You can prune the runners back if you want them to produce fruits, remember what we talked about earlier, or keep them at a minimum unless you're growing replacement plants. If your day neutral plants are weak after you planting them and they're really not very vigorous, you can cut them back to a few leaves to encourage new growth. For your pest management, you've got your vertebrate pests, your invertebrate pests, your pathogens and diseases, and your abiotic disorders. Gophers, and I haven't had problems with gophers and strawberries, and it's not a question we get that much, but gophers are, in my property, they go after my trees, and everybody's property, they seem to do a little bit of different, they have different tastes that they like. If you are having problems with gophers, then pretty much the best way to deal with gophers is through a mechanical barrier, either with like a hardware cloth or putting your plants in pots. Gophers, you can also do some trapping and pest management, and you can find on our UC Integrated Pest Management site information about managing gophers. But the long and short of it is it needs to be mechanical or physical barriers. So either you're putting up hardware cloth or you're putting them in pots or something. Remember, whatever sort of pest management you do, that the vegetables require, like I said earlier, 6 to 8 hours of light. But actually, this slide, like you have this these really cool raised beds here that have these liftable on the upper right-hand side, that has these like flaps that you can lift up. So it's screened to keep pests out. And then you can lift these flaps up and have them open. And I have this in here just to remind you that definitely strawberries need full access to pollinators. So if you had beds like this, and you would want to make sure that they had full access to pollinators. So whether you closed it at night or whatever, but just keep that in mind. Here's some other raised bed ideas where you can do some pest management. Strawberries kind of bed down for the winter, and if you get kind of cold weather, you should be able to mulch them. You could put plastic over them, but because they sort of go dormant, then they probably don't need that. But that's an option here in the back where they have like cattle panels and then they have this plastic over it. Again, if like in the summertime for some vegetables, sometimes people put a shade cloth over these hoop house arrangements. And you just want to make sure whatever you do, you're getting those strawberries full access to pollinators. So this might be an idea, for example. This is obviously way bigger than you need for strawberries, but if squirrels are a problem, this would still give full access to pollinators, but not allow the squirrels in there. Here's another option because strawberries are low to the ground. Another thing you could do to allow pollinators in, but keep squirrels out. Our UC Integrated Pest Management site is our go-to as master gardeners. And it not only has information about pests, but it kind of spells out the different things that we talked about today about planting your strawberries. So we're definitely going to drop this in the chat. Here's some common invertebrate pests. So, and your other vertebrate pests aside from gophers would be squirrels and rats and mice and rabbits and maybe deer or birds. And for all of those pests, pretty much the strategy is physical barriers to keep them away. Your invertebrate pests, Here is a leaf roller, and you've got your snails and slugs, and here's mites as well. So these are some different pests that when you go to the integrated pest management site, then they have photos of these pests, and then they also have least toxic ways to manage these pests. Just remember any kind of spray that you're using, if the strawberries are in bloom. If you're spraying for mites, that can impact other beneficial predators that might visit your plants. And then also if you have strawberries on the vine, you want to make sure you're treating them with something that's least toxic. So always use the least toxic methods, and our Master Gardener helpline, once again, can be there to help you strategize how to protect your plants. Some common diseases, here's on the left, the verticillium wilt. And that was the one, if you're having problems with that, then you definitely don't want to be planting plants in the Solanaceae family. Those are like your tomatoes and potatoes and eggplants and peppers, because they're susceptible to these as well. Here's leaf spot, and then here's some molds and fungus. Some of these diseases are spread by moisture and some of them aren't, but definitely keeping moisture off of the leaves of your plants can help keep diseases down, and keeping your fruit up off the ground and keeping it from getting wet will help keep disease down as well. Environmental disorders that are related to cultural practices or how we care for our plants, and also the temperatures, are a few of these. So like this misshaping of the strawberries sometimes happens if we have a late cold season, like if your plants, if we get an early spring and your plants start to make flowers in March, and then we get a cold May or a cold April, then it can lead to this. And also poor pollination can lead to this as well. These are examples of nitrogen deficiency or nutrient deficiencies, a leaf that's low in phosphorus. And then here's your salt burn. And so you can see how the leaf is not wilted at all, but the edge is very brown. And this is the same symptoms that you'll see in a tree or any of your other plants. So anytime you see this edge that's brown and the rest of the plant is kind of green and normal looking, this is from salt toxicity. We see it a lot of times when we have a really dry year. Avocados are really susceptible to it. And so you'll see it in avocados often when we haven't had a lot of rain. You may see this if you over fertilize and you use like a drip irrigation. And basically it's just salt building up in the soil. And fertilizer is basically salts. You know, there's some nutrients in the fertilizer, but a lot of what's in the fertilizer are just different agents to help keep it, you know, all in solution, or it's not in its solution, but together in a sort of a granular form. And so those things can build up in the soil. And if you have like a drip irrigation system that has very targeted watering, and especially if you have sandy soil and the water goes straight down and doesn't move across a lot, then that can build up. And so anytime you have that salt toxicity, the best way to manage it is to flush your soil. So if you've been using drip irrigation, you might want to water with the hose and just flush those nutrients down to help flush those salts out of the soil. So for harvesting, you want to harvest when they're fully ripe and almost fully colored in. Leaving them on the plant too long encourages unwanted guests and pests and diseases. And if you want to prolong their shelf life, you want to keep the calyx, which is right here, and a little bit of the stem. And if you have some of your freshly harvested strawberries, you want to make sure that you're checking them regularly for any moisture, and that if one is starting to spoil, you remove it, because it will spread very quickly. So for seed saving, we talked about this a little bit already, but you can save them, any of these seeds. So many seeds you can save, but can you start them? And so strawberry seeds are pretty hard to start. They need a period of cold before sprouting. And then they also need to be very shallow. So you basically want to put the seeds just on the surface of well-draining soil. And this strawberryplants.org, it's not a university site. And I do think they advertise, I think they sell things, so we're not endorsing that. But they had a really great section on strawberry seeds, an interesting section. So strawberry seeds would be something you would want to try just sort of for the adventure of it all. Here's my 2 pages of resources. We have general strawberry information from our Master Gardener webpage. We have our UC integrated pest management information. Here is something, this is for commercial growers, but if you'd like to know more about how they grow strawberries on the large scale, you could check that out. The California Strawberry Commission also had some interesting information. And then this strawberryplants.org had some pretty good information, a lot of good information on caring for plants and different elements of strawberry planting. I really like that website. Then there's the citrus greening site, and I'm going to put all those in the chat. We'd love for you to follow us on social media at MGP Sandburn is our Facebook and Twitter and Instagram handle, I guess you call it. And then I know that you've been to our website because you've registered for our class. So check for January classes in the next week or so. I'll be putting those up. And you can also click on the website to sign up for our monthly newsletter where we send out information about upcoming classes and our horticultural advisor and more, right, blogs. And here's our helpline information. I'm going to drop all these things in the chat, and I'll also be posting this on our website on that recent presentations tab. And then we'll also put together, I think I have a resource sheet for this, and I'll put that together too. I'm going to drop these in the chat. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them while I'm dropping these in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. So thank you for joining us today.